In the year 1258, the Tigris River in Baghdad turned two colors. Black from the ink of books, books thrown into the water from the house of wisdom. Red from the blood of a city that had stood as the intellectual capital of the Islamic world. For 500 years, the men who did this had no written language a generation earlier. They had no single permanent city. They did not know how to besiege a walled fortress. Not until they conquered people who did. In less than 100 years, they built the largest connected land empire in human history. Larger than Rome at its height. Larger than the empire Alexander carved out. He had a professional army and a royal treasury behind him. Larger than anything before or since. This is the story of how that happened. Not a story of mindless destruction, though there was plenty of that. A story of the most efficient military machine the pre-modern world ever built. One that treated terror not as rage, but as a tool, calculated. Deployed with brutal precision, because fear was cheaper than a siege. By the end of this video, you will understand something. How a confederation of feuding herders conquered a quarter of the inhabited earth. Herders with no cities of their own. In 25 years. Here's the real question. How do you build the largest empire in history with no permanent capital? No shared written language until you invent one out of necessity. No siege technology of your own, and you will understand why. The moment the man who built it died, the whole thing nearly came apart. In his son's hands. This is an AI reconstruction of a world that left almost no cities behind. Because the Mongols themselves rarely built any. What we can rebuild instead is everything they moved through, the felt tents, the horse herds stretching to the horizon, the walls of Samarkand and Baghdad in the last hours before they fell. Let's go back to where it all began, not in a palace, in a tent. On a grassland with no name that any empire had bothered to draw on a map. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not empty. It was crowded with small, mobile, heavily armed nations. Nations who hated each other with real intimacy. The intimacy of people who share the same rivers, the same grazing land. Tatars, Merkits, Khanates, Naimans, Taijiut. Mongols were just one clan among many and not the strongest one. Into this world around 1162, a boy named Temujin was born. Son of a minor chieftain named Yesugei. His birth name, by tradition, comes from a rival chief. A chief his father had just defeated in battle, Temujin Ujei. A naming custom meant to carry the enemy's strength into the newborn. He would need that strength sooner than anyone expected. When Temujin was around 9, his father was poisoned by Tatars. Poisoned at a feast, a slow death disguised as hospitality. The clan that had followed Yesugei did not follow his widow and his young sons. They abandoned the family on the steppe. No protection, no herds, no status. A family with no clan on the steppe was not just poor, it was prey. Steppe life itself left no room for weakness. Families lived in a jur, a round felt tent. A wooden lattice frame wrapped in layers of wool felt, fully collapsible. Built to move with the herds, season after season. Losing your herd meant losing your home in days. What follows in the sources is genuinely hard to verify. The earliest surviving account, The Secret History of the Mongols, was compiled decades later. Compiled by people with every reason to build a legend. But the broad shape is accepted by most historians. Years of near starvation. A period of captivity in a wooden neck yoke. Captivity that followed Temujin killing his own half-brother in a dispute over food. An escape that should not have worked. He survived that childhood. Most children in his position did not. By his 20s, Temujin was rebuilding what his father had lost. Not through inherited authority, he had none left. Through something the steppe respected more, loyalty earned, not owed. He built a following of men bound to him personally. Not by blood, a radical structural choice, one that would define everything he built afterward. Betrayal, alliance, betrayal again. The years after his father's death read less like a royal biography. More like a war of every family against every family. One man slowly outlasted them all. In 1206, at the source of the Onan River, the surviving clan leaders gathered. Gathered for a Kurultai, a great council. They did something that had never quite happened before. They gave one man authority over all of them. And they gave him a new name, Genghis Khan. The meaning is still debated among linguists. Universal ruler is the popular translation, though some scholars argue for fierce ruler or oceanic ruler. What is not debated is what happened next. He did not simply command the tribes. He dismantled them. The old clan structure had made the steppe ungovernable for centuries. It was broken apart, replaced with a decimal military system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, cutting across old tribal lines. A man's loyalty now ran upward to his commander and ultimately to the Khan. Not sideways to his cousins. It was, in effect, the erasure of the old steppe order. And the invention of a new one, built for war. The new army needed rules. Genghis Khan established the yasa, a code of law. Mostly oral, living, changed over time. It banned things like theft and false testimony. No full text survives today. What we know comes from later sources. But then, a nation built for war needs an enemy. Genghis Khan had just spent decades ending one kind of conflict. He was about to begin a much larger one. The neighboring Jin dynasty in northern China had a long-standing policy. For generations, they treated the steppe tribes with bribery and calculated cruelty, playing them against each other to keep them weak. Genghis Khan had grown up inside that policy. In 1211, he turned his new machine against the people who built it. The campaign against the Jin threw the Mongols into unfamiliar warfare, walled cities. A mounted army is built for open steppe combat. It does not know how to breach a fortified gate. So the Mongols did something that explains this whole empire. They did not stubbornly insist on doing things their own way. They absorbed. Chinese engineers were captured and recruited. Persian and Muslim engineers, too, integrated wholesale into the Mongol war machine. They brought siege technology, trebuchets, counterweight catapults, gunpowder devices. Technology the Mongols had never invented and never needed. By 1215, the imperial capital, Zhongdu, fell near modern Beijing. The besieging army was Mongol in command, but increasingly international in expertise. This pattern, steal the tool, keep the momentum, repeated for 60 years. Nowhere more visibly than at Kaifeng in 1232 and 1233. Mongol forces encircled the Jin dynasty's last major capital with a wall of their own. 54 miles around the city. They deployed every siege technology their engineers could provide, including early gunpowder thunder crash bombs. A steppe army with no walls a generation earlier was now building them. Meanwhile, to the west, an empire called Khwarezmia was about to make a catastrophic misjudgment. Genghis Khan, by most accounts, did not initially want war with Khwarezmia. He sent a trade caravan, by some counts 450 merchants. Along with a formal diplomatic overture, it went to the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II. The governor of a border city, Otrar, seized the entire caravan, executed the merchants as spies. Historians still disagree whether this was his own initiative or the Shah's order. One governor's decision. An empire's death sentence. Genghis Khan sent envoys demanding the governor be punished. The Shah had the envoys killed too. Some accounts say their beards were burned off first. A calculated insult, not just a refusal. What followed between 1219 and 1221 was less a war than a demonstration. Otrar fell first. The offending governor reportedly had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. A punishment matched precisely to his crime. Then came Bukhara. Then Samarkand, among the wealthiest cities on earth, centers of trade, scholarship, Islamic learning. Chroniclers describe populations in the hundreds of thousands slaughtered or enslaved. Cities leveled so completely, some never recovered their size for centuries. The numbers themselves are contested. Medieval chroniclers routinely inflated body counts for effect. Modern historians differ sharply on how literally to take them. Some figures claim over 1 million dead in a single city. Estimates for total casualties across all Mongol conquests vary wildly, from a few 100,000 at the low end to as high as 40 or 60 million at the high end. Historians like Jack Weatherford lean toward the higher figures. Others, like Morris Rasabi, argue for far more conservative numbers. Numbers grounded in what surviving sources can actually support. The honest answer is that no one knows, and the range itself tells you something. Something about how much of this history was written by the losing side. What is not contested is the strategic logic behind the brutality. A city that resisted and lost was destroyed almost totally. Specifically, so the next city down the road would not resist at all. Terror, used as a substitute for a siege you don't have time to fight. Muhammad II fled westward across his own collapsing empire. He died in 1220 or 1221, sources vary, reportedly of pleurisy, alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, wrapped in his own attendant's clothes because he had nothing else left. The ruler of one of the great Islamic powers died wearing a stranger's coat. By 1221, in barely 2 years, the Khwarezmian Empire had ceased to exist. It had stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. And Genghis Khan was only getting started. But the man who carried this empire's armies furthest was not a prince. He did not come from steppe aristocratic at all. His name was Subutai. By tradition, he began life as the son of a blacksmith, a commoner in a warrior culture built on inherited status. Somewhere in his youth, he joined Genghis Khan's following, not through birth. The same way Genghis Khan himself had rebuilt his power, through demonstrated loyalty and results. He rose to become one of the Khan's 4 most trusted men, nicknamed one of his 4 dogs of war, a title meant as the highest compliment the steppe knew, a blacksmith's son. He commanded the largest army Europe had ever faced. It was Subutai, decades later, who planned the twin invasions of Poland and Hungary. In 1241, 2 separate armies on 2 separate fronts, hundreds of kilometers apart. They moved on a coordinated timetable. No radio, no telegraph, nothing faster than a relay of horses. Modern military historians still study this campaign. One of the most sophisticated feats of long-distance coordination in the pre-industrial world. On par with anything Napoleon would attempt 6 centuries later. Planned by a man most people have never heard of. By his death, around 1248, Subutai was credited with something remarkable: conquering more territory than any commander in history, working for an empire that never asked where he came from, only what he could do. It's one of the clearest windows into why this machine worked. Birthright mattered far less here than almost anywhere else in the era. That alone let the Mongols draw talent from populations their rivals never thought to look at. Here is a number that surprises almost everyone. These armies were usually smaller than the forces they defeated. The image of an endless, faceless horde is largely a myth, manufactured by terrified chroniclers on the losing side. It survived 8 centuries because it's a simpler story than the truth. The truth is more unsettling. The Mongols won with fewer men again and again. Through mobility, discipline, and coordinated deception. Deception that professional European and Middle Eastern armies were not prepared to face. Every Mongol warrior typically rode with multiple horses, rotating mounts to maintain speeds no single horse army could match. Composite bows built from horn, wood, and sinew could outrange European bows. Mongol riders trained from childhood to fire accurately from a galloping horse. A skill that took most cultures a lifetime to approximate. The Mongols simply grew up inside it. Their armor, often raw silk beneath leather or lamellar plates, had a brutal purpose. An arrowhead striking silk pushes the fabric into the wound, rather than shredding it. A battlefield surgeon could pull the arrow out along with the silk. Rather than digging metal fragments from torn flesh, it was medical technology disguised as clothing. And then there was the intelligence network. Before any campaign, scouts and merchant spies mapped terrain, counted garrisons, and identified political rivalries to exploit. Merchants moved freely between hostile courts. Nobody suspected a traitor of counting soldiers. They spread deliberate rumors ahead of the army, rumors of unstoppable numbers, of massacres in cities that had chosen to fight. By the time the real army arrived, many targets had already half defeated themselves through panic alone. They rarely needed the largest army. They needed the army everyone believed was the largest. The conquests that followed reshaped the map of Eurasia. Genghis Khan died in 1227. The cause, even the exact location, remain disputed. Theories range from a battle wound to a fall from a horse, to, in later and less credible legend, assassination during a wedding night. His body was buried in a location deliberately kept secret. Reportedly, everyone involved in the burial was executed, and a river was diverted over the site. Historians treat that detail with real caution. It sounds conveniently legendary. To this day, despite real search efforts, his tomb has never been found. His empire did not die with him. Under his successors, his son Ogedei, his grandsons Manka, Kublai, Hulagu, the conquests continued. On a scale genuinely hard to hold in your head. Mongol armies swept through Russia between 1237 and 1240, reducing Kiev to what one contemporary called barely 200 houses standing. They pushed into Poland and Hungary in 1241, annihilating a combined European force at Legnica. They crushed the Hungarian army at Mohi within days. Two armies, two fronts, destroyed almost simultaneously, an operational feat that stunned European commanders. Commanders who had never coordinated anything at that scale. And then, at the edge of Western Europe, the road to Vienna stood open. The Mongol armies turned around and rode home. The most commonly cited explanation is administrative, not military. Word had reached the commanders that Ogedei had died. Under Mongol succession custom, senior princes had to return for a Kurultai. This traditional version traces back to the historian Rashid al-Din, but it has problems. Historian Lisa Power notes something important. Mongol commanders were reportedly already deep in Ukraine when the news reached them. That weakens a clean cause and effect story. Two competing explanations sit alongside it. Climate historians Ulf Bunten and Nicola Di Cosmo link the withdrawal to weather. an unusually cold, wet stretch across Central Europe in 1241 and 1242. Bad harvests, disease, grazing land too poor for tens of thousands of war horses. Separately, power herself argues something else. The Mongols may have taken heavier losses in Hungary than the chronicles admit, and reconsidered the campaign on military grounds alone. Most historians today land somewhere in between. Not one clean cause, several pressures arriving at once. What we do know, Europe had no coordinated answer to what it had witnessed. It was saved not by its own armies, but by a funeral 8,000 kilometers away. Under Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, the empire reached its peak, and at the same time, the beginning of its fracture. Kublai completed the conquest of Song China in 1279, founding the Yuan dynasty, becoming, by most measures, ruler of the wealthiest state on earth. A grandson of a man who grew up starving on the steppe now ruled an empire. More subjects than any king in history. Almost none of them shared his language or his gods. Before Zhongdu, there was Karakoram, the empire's first true capital, built under Ogedei. Archaeologists have since mapped its ruins in detail, a city of foreign artisans and temples, with a famous silver fountain that poured 4 kinds of drink. Built by nomads for an empire that had outgrown its tents. Marco Polo's account is treated with a healthy mix of fascination and skepticism. He tended toward exaggeration. He described a court of almost unimaginable splendor at Kublai's summer capital, Zhongdu. English readers would later know the city through Coleridge's poem as Xanadu. What is verifiable beyond the palace descriptions? The Mongol court under Kublai blended 2 traditions. Chinese bureaucratic tradition with steppe military command structure. A hybrid system neither pure conquest nor pure assimilation could have produced alone. Most of Kublai's own Mongol nobility resented it for the rest of his reign. This was Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The part of this story that gets buried under the body count, because it doesn't fit the simpler narrative. The same empire that leveled Samarkand also built and maintained the Yam, a relay postal system of mounted riders and staging posts, stretched across the entire empire. It let messages and goods move faster across Eurasia than almost any point before the railroad. Reportedly safe enough that a lone merchant could carry gold the length of the empire, without an armed guard. The empire that burned the House of Wisdom in Baghdad also protected the trade routes. Routes that carried its book's ideas westward for 2 more centuries. Running this empire required more than an army. The Mongols appointed officials called darugachi. They kept order in conquered provinces, collecting taxes, passing orders down. Merchants carried a passport called a paisa, a small metal or wooden tablet. It guaranteed safe passage, fresh horses, lodging. A functioning bureaucracy built by people who grew up in tents. Genghis Khan's approach to religion adds another layer historians still argue about. He was not, by most credible accounts, driven by religious conversion at all. Mongol rule tolerated and sometimes actively protected Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists. But tolerance had a hard limit, and it was political, not spiritual. The Ismaili sect, known as the Assassins in Persia, turned from religious devotion to political threat. Hulagu's forces hunted their mountain fortresses down, one by one, and wiped them out almost entirely. Tolerance, like everything else in this empire, was a tool, extended freely, withdrawn instantly the moment it stopped serving control. But an empire this vast, built this fast, carried the seeds of its own division. Built into its structure from the very beginning, the fracture has a precise starting point. When the great Khan Monka died in 1259, two of his younger brothers claimed succession. Kublai and Arik Buk, the empire tore itself apart in civil war. Kublai won in 1264, but the war itself permanently severed the western khanates from the center. Even after one family kept nominal rule over all of it. By the 1260s, the United Empire had effectively split into 4 khanates. The Golden Horde ruled Russia and the Eurasian steppe. The Ilkhanate ruled Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty ruled China. Each grew increasingly independent, each developing its own religious and cultural character. Each in time warred with the others as often as with outsiders. It was the Ilkhanate under Hulagu Khan that carried out the destruction this video began with. In 1258, Hulagu's forces surrounded Baghdad, seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. For 5 centuries, one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The siege lasted roughly a month. The Caliph al-Mustasim badly misjudged both his own strength and Mongol patience. He refused terms that might have spared the city. What followed, according to multiple sources, was days of systematic slaughter. The House of Wisdom, the Great Library, center of translation and scholarship, burned. Its contents thrown into the Tigris. In such volume, later writers claimed the river ran black with ink for days, and red with blood for days after that. Whether that specific image is literal or vivid metaphor, historians still debate. The underlying catastrophe is not in dispute at all. The effective end of Baghdad's 500-year status as an intellectual capital. Al-Mustasim himself was executed by a method chosen by tradition for a specific reason: to avoid spilling royal blood on the ground. Reportedly wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses. Even this detail carries the same uncertainty as much of the era's vivid reporting. An empire built this fast, held together this loosely, is fragile. It does not need an external enemy to unravel. It only needs time. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty began weakening within a century of its founding. Worn down by expensive, largely unsuccessful invasions of Japan and Vietnam, internal corruption, the resentment of a Chinese population that never fully accepted foreign rule. In 1368, rebel forces drove the last Yuan emperor out of China.
ending a century of Mongol rule over the region Kublai once considered the empire's crown jewel.
The Golden Horde in Russia lasted longer. Its capital was Sarai, a city on the Volga River. By some accounts, one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. Multicultural, wealthy, built almost entirely from tribute and trade. Archaeologists are still searching for its exact location today. The Horde gradually weakened under rising Russian principalities.
Ivan the Great's refusal to keep paying tribute in 1480 marks the symbolic end.
The end of what Russian history calls the Mongol yoke. 2.5 centuries after it began. And there is one more legacy of this empire. Nothing to do with borders or trade routes, everything to do with biology. A 2003 genetic study found a single Y chromosome lineage, carried by roughly 8% of men across a broad stretch of Asia. From eastern China to Central Asia, that's an estimated 16 million men alive today.
All descended from one common ancestor.
The researchers linked that ancestor with real but not absolute confidence to Genghis Khan himself, or his close male line. Given the timing and the geography lining up almost exactly with the empire's core. Later genetic research has refined the picture without overturning the basic finding. It remains one of the most striking signals in human population genetics. Even as the exact identity of that founding ancestor stays under discussion, not absolutely settled fact. So, return to the question this video opened with.
How did a people with no cities conquer so much?
No writing system, no siege technology of their own. A quarter of the Earth's land in 25 years. Not through numbers. Their armies were usually smaller than the enemy's. Not through blind savagery. The destruction, brutal as it was, followed a calculated logic. Designed to make the next city surrender without a fight. They won by building the most efficient military machine the pre-modern world had ever seen. One willing to absorb any tool, any expertise, any technology that worked, regardless of where it came from. And they won by understanding something that still unsettles historians 800 years later. That fear, deployed with precision, is cheaper than a war. The empire that terror built could not survive on terror alone. Within a century of Kublai Khan's death, the pieces Genghis Khan had welded together drifted apart into 4 separate, often hostile successor states. But the roads they built, the trade they protected, the exchange of ideas they enabled, all of it outlived the empire itself by centuries. Arguably, that legacy shaped the world that came after, more permanently than the conquests ever did. The steppe that Temujin was born onto had no name. No empire had bothered to write one down. By the time his grandsons were finished, there was almost no map left unchanged. Because of what started there. The House of Wisdom this video opened with had already stood for 500 years. 5 centuries in which Baghdad was the single greatest center of learning on Earth. Next time, we go back to that city, before its ending.
To see exactly what a civilization built there.
And why it took an empire like this one to bring it down. As always, we'll see you in the past. What stays with me about the Mongols isn't the destruction. It's how thoroughly efficiency and terror sat side by side in the same machine. Same men, same empire, no contradiction felt necessary to anyone involved. We like to imagine great powers as either builders or destroyers. The Mongols were both at once, without any sense that this was strange. They burned the House of Wisdom, and they protected the roads that carried its ideas west for 2 more centuries. They ruled by fear and by tolerance, switching between the two the moment one stopped working. I think that's the real lesson here, not about the 13th century, but about power itself. Every great power remembers its own achievements more clearly than what it cost to build them. Rome did it. Every empire that came after the Mongols has done it too, including, in some form, whichever one you're watching this from. The steppe Temujin was born onto had no name, because no one thought it mattered. Within one lifetime, there wasn't a map left that didn't have to account for it. That's not really a story about the past. It's a question about how quickly doesn't matter can become ruled everything, and who gets to notice before it's too late.